Well, welcome to another episode of Policy Gone Viral. I'm Logan Padgett. I'm joined with JMI's Vice President of Policy, Sal Nuzzo. And we're also joined with Dr. Sam Staley, who's the Executive Director of the Devoe Elmore Center at Florida State University. And he's also a member of JMI's Research Advisory Council. So thanks so much for being here, Dr. Staley.
Great. Thank you for having me. It's a great opportunity.
So let's dive right in. A lot of attention in the last several months has been placed on a unique policy concept called qualified immunity. Before we dive into ideas for reform, can you give us a quick high-level explanation of what qualified immunity means?
Okay, it's a great question, and it's actually pretty confusing for a lot of people because it doesn't make sense in a lot of ways. But the idea, it's actually qualified immunity was something that's created by the Supreme Court. It's actually not a statute or a law. And essentially what the court said was that if you are conducting business of government, that you shouldn't be liable for someone suing you, usually for a frivolous claim because you were doing your job. And this applies across the board. What we're talking about and what I was talking about in the article for the journal is how it is applied to law enforcement. And that's different, and the stakes are actually much higher. Because essentially what it says is that if you're in law enforcement and you're conducting your business, if you make a mistake, you're not liable for that. Now that's a very high level explanation for it, so it actually gets a little bit more complicated. So it's not like it's completely you're not liable. There are cases, but as a practical matter, what's happened is that law enforcement can commit some pretty serious errors, including resulting in the death of innocent people, and they are not legally liable for that bad decision or poor judgment.
Right, and that was a great explanation. You recently authored an article on this for our latest issue of the journal. So thinking about this concept in light of the current environment of policing, why is it important?
Well, I think it's actually really, really important. And I will admit, for me, in doing the research, I had to be convinced that this was a real problem, because I certainly understand, and I'm actually someone who's trained in self-defense, and I actually am engaged in martial arts, and as for self-defense, I was intuitively thinking, okay, well, you're making these split-minute or split-second decisions, and a lot of judgment. You're relying on your training. You don't always have all the perfect information that you need. Mistakes are likely to happen. So shouldn't we be shielding people from trying to do the right thing and actually ending up making this mistake? Well, the reality is, when we look at what happens on the ground, is we're finding that those bad apples in law enforcement are making these bad decisions over and over again, and they're escaping liability for those bad decisions. And it's not just the individual, it's the police department itself. So there's no incentive to get rid of the bad apples or to change policies in such a way so that we have better training, so that we actually have our law enforcement able to more effectively deal with various situations as they come up. And so that's, in law enforcement, I think this has become much more important. We're finding that less than 1% of the officers that are charged with excessive force, where the finding has been that they improperly used excessive force, are actually held liable financially or otherwise for those actions. So I believe, as a practical matter, we need to really go think very carefully about qualified immunity, and really think seriously about trying to enact policies that restore that accountability in law enforcement for poor decision making.
Well, and in the article, I'm glad you mentioned the word incentives, because in the article you discuss and kind of articulate a pretty unique policy idea that's based on free market principles. And so before I kind of have some follow-up questions on that, can you elaborate on the idea of what a policy solution or policy reform to this might look like?
Yeah, and I'll have to give a sociologist, Rashawn Ray, at the University of Maryland and Brookings Institution, the credit for this, because it was just a brilliant idea when I saw it. So I'm as an economist and a policy analyst, I'm always looking for institutional reforms.
Mhm.
In other words, and I, as also someone who works a little bit in self-defense and have really looked at criminal justice reform for decades, actually, at this point, while I'm sympathetic to the idea that we have these bad apples, when you have enough bad apples, you need institutional reform. And the question is, what does that look like? And what Dr. Ray did, came up with the idea is that, well, let's change the incentives institution wide. Essentially, what we should have our law enforcement agencies do is have what is the equivalent of malpractice insurance that is from the private sector. Because once you're paying premiums that are based on either actuarial data
Mhm.
or assessments of risk, now it's not just about the bad apple, it's about how do we get us to think differently as an organization? How does that change? So it's not just the bad apple, it's how do we, one, get rid of the bad apples because they're actually forcing us to spend a lot more money on these premiums? How do we get the organization to contain those bad apples if we have to keep them? And so it's more systemic. So this, I think, is a brilliant idea. I wish I had thought about it, but all the credit goes to Professor Ray. And this is something I think we can really do seriously, and not only in Florida, but I think across the board.
Well, it's a concept. Has it led to any real-time examples that either states or localities have taken it on, or would Florida really be kind of a test case if we were to go down this path?
I think that's what one, the straight answer is I'm not aware of law enforcement agencies that have adopted this. I think it's a very new idea. It's a very outside the box idea and very creative idea. So it's clearly an area where Florida could establish itself as a leader. And not only that, given the diversity of our state and the different kinds of problems that we've run into, urban, rural, African American, white, wherever, Latino, whatever it might be, there's a real opportunity to test this. And so what it looks like in specifics, I don't think we know yet. However, the concept is completely doable. We have malpractice insurance for physicians
Mm-hmm.
and for all sorts of people working in very delicate and difficult spaces where the harm of an error be very, we should be able to do this in law enforcement. So, so I think it really warrants a lot of discussion. It is very much a market-oriented approach, and it gets us out of politics. In other words, it's not about the police commissioner versus the mayor versus the county administrator or city manager. It's more like, how do we try to reduce these costs by reducing risk, by essentially having a more effective law enforcement agency?
So if I am an elected individual in the state of Florida, whether state, local, whatever, and I'm interested in something like this, what would a policy path, look like to even begin this discussion?
Well, of course, it depends on where you're entering the discussion, right? So if I were an elected official in the state legislature, first thing I would do is organize a hearing. And I'd invite Professor Ray down to talk about this, and that would be. And there are other people that could come in and also speak to this. You want to have other constituencies and stakeholders involved, even though we would think that there'd be resistance by the police unions, for example. The reality is, if they can address the bad apple problem, that helps them a lot.
Sure.
In as a manager, as a human resource manager and someone who's run organizations, I don't look at individuals necessarily as people that shouldn't be in the organization. If they're not performing, I ask myself, maybe there's a better role. So if someone can't handle the pressure of the street, maybe they could actually be really good behind a desk. Or maybe they could be really good in another context in which law enforcement agencies operate. So we need to get our agencies to be thinking in that way. And this is an institutional reform that would do that. On the other hand, if you're an interested citizen or active and you're an interest group, Frankly, the best thing to do, again, let's go out to Dr. Ray
Mhm.
and have him come down and keynote a seminar or a symposium and do it at a high profile campus like Florida State. We actually have a number of different institutes which have been created to further these conversations, including an Institute for Politics. But it could also be the University of Florida, it could be Florida International, it could be any number, University of South Florida. But the key is to raise a profile and start a conversation. And if we start this conversation, then we can figure out the details. It's eminently doable. The question is what changes do we have to make in statute that would enable this to happen? And we don't need the Supreme Court or the judiciary to bless it. We can do this independently of that.
Well, Dr. Staley, thank you so much. This is a great topic for us to dive into. It's definitely something that I think we may want to revisit later into 2021 as the conversation continues. And I do look forward to you being a part of that. So thank you very much for the article and for today's episode.
All right, great. Thank you for having me. It's been a great opportunity and love working with the James Madison Institute.